With just 2 days to go until Britain's general election, a poll by YouGov shows Conservative Theresa May won't win a parliamentary majority. Tuesday's survey shows the Prime Minister on track to secure 304 seats. That's 22 short of the 326 she would need to govern alone. The opposition Labour Party likely to win 266 seats, according to YouGov's model, that down from 268 on Monday. A poll on Monday night by Survation for ITV showed the Conservative Party lead narrowing to just 1 point. When the Prime Minister called the snap election, her advantage stood at 20 points. Though it's worth remembering how wildly inaccurate the pollsters were for the 2015 general election. Brexit was meant to be the focal point of this campaign, but after 3 militant attacks in 3 months, that's been completely overshadowed. Security is now dominating the agenda. Theresa May is facing criticism for her role in overseeing a drop of 20,000 in the number of police officers in England and Wales.
Thanks very much, Neil.
But the PM hitting back, saying that her rival, Labour's Jeremy Corbyn, voted against anti-terrorism legislation.
You're watching Reuters TV. Here are your top stories.
Trump gets involved in the fight that split the Arab world.
British police name the 3rd London Bridge attacker. Prince Harry says game on down under.
This is Reuters Now.
Wading into the worst rift between powerful Arab states in decades. US President Donald Trump saying Tuesday that his trip to the Middle East last month was already paying off, as Arab leaders accuse Qatar of funding militant groups. His blunt remarks on Twitter suggesting that the anti-Islamist speech he gave in Riyadh in May inspired Arab powers to cut diplomatic ties and suspend flights to Qatar. US officials in Washington, though, telling Reuters they were blindsided by Saudi Arabia's coordinated move against Doha. Egypt, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates immediately followed suit. People panic buying in Doha on Tuesday. Videos posted on social media showing empty shelves and shoppers stocking up. Saudi Arabia also revoking the licence of Qatar Airways and ordering its offices to close. Qatar denies the Arab ruler's accusations that it backs Iran and supports what they called terrorism. Trump saying Arab leaders warned him on his trip that Qatar was funding, quote, radical ideology after he'd demanded they take action. Adding perhaps this will be the beginning of the end to the horror of terrorism. His intervention appears to contradict the picture US officials painted on Monday, in which the United States would quietly calm the waters between Riyadh and Doha. Tiny Qatar, the world's richest state per capita, seen as too important to US military and diplomatic interests to be isolated. It hosts the largest US airbase in the Middle East, a staging ground for US-led strikes on Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria.
At least 2 out of the 3 men who staged the knife and vehicle attack in London were already known to authorities in the UK or elsewhere. An Italian source telling Reuters the 3rd man to be identified, Moroccan-Italian Youssef Zagba, had been flagged by Italian authorities to the UK after he moved to England last year. Police had already named the other 2 as Pakistani-born Briton Khurram Shazid Butt and 30-year-old Rashid Redouan. Butt certainly was known to UK intelligence services, though he wasn't considered a serious enough threat for close monitoring. This is said to be his CV, detailing his work for Transport for London.
Extremists, including ISIS.
And last year he appeared in a TV documentary called The Jihadis Next Door. One neighbour had reported him for trying to radicalise her children, and another for listening to extremist sermons online. So why wasn't more done to cover such a high-profile suspect? Reuters' Mike Holden.
The police themselves say this is incredibly hard. You have 23,000 people who have been reported to them as potential jihadis in Britain. Of those, they say 3,000 pose a serious risk. It doesn't require a lot of planning, and so someone can put it together within weeks, and therefore it becomes much, much harder for the police and security services to thwart.
Now security officials say they need a serious rethink regarding how to stop plots as simple and unpredictable as the ones in London and Manchester. At 3 p.m. on Saturday, Butt was asking where he could hire a vehicle. By 11, the deed was done. The police have thwarted 18 plots since 2013 and moved incredibly quickly at London Bridge. Within 8 minutes of the first call, all 3 assailants were dead. But it's Britain's third attack in 3 months, all of them involving people already on the police or MI5 radar. That puts the police and Prime Minister Theresa May under mounting pressure.
Critics of Theresa May would say you've cut policing. A lot of the intelligence that leads to the intelligence services and the police finding out who may be at risk comes from neighbourhood policing, comes from having officers out on the street, talking to people in the local communities.
With Britons due to vote in a general election on Thursday, security has shot to the top of the political agenda. Police, politicians and the public all wondering if more could have been done.
Paris police have shot a man who assaulted an officer with a hammer outside the city's Notre Dame Cathedral. Law enforcement sources telling Reuters the man threatened officers with the hammer and was shot in the torso when he refused to stop. One officer sustained light injuries, they say. The extent of the suspect's wounds wasn't made clear. France's interior minister says the suspect shouted, "This is for Syria," during the incident. The country's counterterrorism office has already opened an investigation. Europe is in the midst of a wave of militant attacks inspired by Islamic extremism, and Paris has seen some of the worst of those incidents. Tuesday's attack taking place at one of the city's top tourism spots. It comes just days after militants staged a knife and vehicle attack in London.
Bill Cosby's primary accuser taking the stand Tuesday, former Temple University employee Andrea Constand testifying with harrowing details that the comedian drugged and sexually assaulted her in 2004. Constand described Cosby as a mentor, someone she trusted. One night he allegedly gave her what he said were herbal pills. Then, she told the court, she felt frozen. He then groped and molested her as she couldn't move, adding, quote, "I wanted it to stop." Reuters legal correspondent Joseph Axe was at the courthouse Tuesday.
This was a big moment in the Bill Cosby scandal. This was the first time they've been face-to-face in a long time since all this broke. And while she was describing to jurors what she said happened at his home on his couch, he was shaking his head, he was putting his hand over his forehead, he was whispering to his attorneys, but he was clearly registering that he disagreed with her testimony. Constand mostly kept it together. She didn't cry much that I saw. Her voice quavered at times, but she was a pretty strong witness in terms of kind of her demeanor. She told the story, she didn't get too emotional. And even during cross-examination, when the defense was going after her fairly hard, she didn't crack at all. This was the dramatic moment that everyone had been looking for when this trial began. She's clearly the hinge on which the outcome of the trial is going to turn. And so it was a pretty dramatic moment. When she took the stand, she walked into the courtroom, there was a lot of murmuring. And when she first began to talk about her relationship with Cosby, people in the audience were riveted.
Dozens of women have accused Cosby of sexually assaulting them under similar circumstances in a series of attacks dating back to the 1960s. Cosby, who his lawyers say is legally blind, is not expected to testify, though he has denied allegations against him.
Ms. Carter? 20-year-old Michelle Carter of Plainville, Massachusetts, waiving her right to a jury this week in an unusual trial over whether she drove her high school boyfriend to suicide. In text messages, Carter, who was 17 at the time, told Conrad Roy, quote, "You need to just do it." When Roy expressed second thoughts, Carter encouraged her boyfriend to get back into his truck, where authorities later found his body and the vehicle filled with carbon monoxide. Prosecutors say the text messages and phone calls made before and during the suicide proved that Carter persuaded Roy to kill himself. Carter's lawyer argues the text messages are protected free speech. Her decision to forego the right to a jury means members of her community will not get to decide her fate. The case will now be tried by the judge. Carter is charged with involuntary manslaughter and faces up to 20 years in prison if convicted.
As the death toll rises in Afghanistan's battle against the Taliban, local soldiers say they're being stretched thin. Whether it's lack of equipment, poor leadership, or chronic corruption, government forces are facing a range of problems and they're desperate for international support. But as Reuters correspondent Mirwais Harouni explains, the one thing they don't want is foreign troops returning to the front lines.
Afghan experts say that it's much better to have Afghan forces on the battleground. They believe that Afghan forces, they know their villages, homes much better than foreigners know. And they also say that in special occasions, like for example, when a district center or a province center is on the verge of collapse, foreign forces should help and should support. But in other cases, they should just provide training and advices to the Afghan security forces, and that's enough.
16 years since the U.S.-led campaign that ousted the Taliban, the U.S. is planning to send up to 5,000 military trainers to the area, prompting concern in Afghanistan that Washington could get sucked back into the war. NATO has repeatedly said it won't resume the combat mission that ended 3 years ago, but officials say plans are being considered to have military trainers from outside participate in operations as Afghan forces struggle to contain the spreading insurgency.
Afghan national security forces do not have enough personnel on the ground. They say that whenever they go to an operation, as soon as they finish that operation, they have to go to another one. That's the reason that when they leave an area, Taliban and other insurgent groups come back to their strongholds.
With the Taliban in control of about 40% of Afghanistan's territory, those insurgent strongholds are becoming increasingly difficult to contain.
Bundles of cash stashed away by Islamic militants in the Philippines. The military saying Tuesday its discovery of $1.6 million in banknotes and checks is evidence that Islamic State-linked fighters are quickly fleeing their hideouts in the besieged city of Marawi. Reuters' Neil Jerome Morales reports from the city where troops are battling insurgents for control.
Islamist militants use this large amount of cash to purchase their own high-powered weapons, to purchase vehicles, to strengthen their cause. The fact that they left this large amount of cash means they have other priorities, particularly moving to other areas, changing positions for the snipers that are giving the government headache in terms of fighting these rebels and taking back the city of Marawi. Also, the government has found networks of tunnels connecting these houses, and there's a stash of ammunition. There are weapons that were previously prepared by the militants and were found by the militants in the homes of Marawi city residents.
Hundreds of civilians still remain trapped in Marawi or held hostage. The prolonged battle sparking fears that ISIS is building a regional base in the southern Philippine island of Mindanao.
Uber telling its employees Tuesday that it's firing more than 20 people, the result of a wide-ranging internal investigation into sexual harassment claims made by former employees. That's according to a person familiar with the internal probe being carried out by an outside law firm. Reuters correspondent Joseph Menn has the details.
In addition to investigating more than 200 specific complaints of harassment, retaliation, and other issues, and acting in at least 58 of those cases so far, it's also instituted policy changes. Those include much deeper training for managers. It turns out that more than half of Uber's managers have never been bosses before.
The source telling Reuters that more cases of harassment are still ongoing, and Menn says those are just the ones being investigated internally.
This is just one of multiple probes that are being conducted. Probably the most prominent one, that shoe is still to drop. That's being conducted in part by former Attorney General Eric Holder. The special committee of the board has gotten briefed on Mr. Holder's recommendations, and those will be conveyed to employees sometime next week.
Aside from Tuesday's terminations, Uber's had a lot of executive turnover. The company's seeking a COO, a CFO, and other senior leaders. Uber is also embroiled in significant civil litigation with Google's Waymo over accusations a former Uber executive stole trade secrets related to its self-driving car technology.
Uber's got a lot going on, and it's going to continue to be a distraction for some time to come.
A royal face taking centre stage in Sydney on Wednesday.
We are here today because in 500 days the Invictus Games will be held in one of the most sport-mad countries and iconic cities in the world.
Britain's Prince Harry launching the countdown of the sporting event, which he set up 3 years ago for wounded war veterans, and meeting with the Australian squad.
It's been a bit of a lifesaver to me, you know. It's a way that I can engage with people and relate to people again.
More than 500 servicemen and women from 17 allied nations will take part in the Games when Sydney takes the baton from Toronto in October next year.
As Australians know better than anyone, sport has an unparalleled ability to bring people together. It has the ability to refocus the mind, to bring a sense of purpose and boost self-confidence.
The Prince also took the opportunity to pay tribute to the victims of Saturday's London attacks, after Australia confirmed that a second citizen had been killed.
Australians form an important and vibrant part of the fabric of life in London, and we are reminded of that in good times and bad. And our hearts go out to the victims, their friends and families.
The attack came as Harry made his first visit to Singapore over the weekend, where he launched an AIDS initiative led by his charity.
You're up to date. Check back later as stories develop.